a post. Yes, got it. Yeah. Okay, so I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Center, and also ARC Center of Excellence for Indigenous Futures. Before starting my PhD, I used to work in an NGO that provided educational support to Indigenous people in Laos. While working for the NGO, which was based in Japan, and also working closely with the Lao government and Indigenous families there, I witnessed the power of global policies. So today, I would like to share some of the insights that I learned through my PhD research, as well as working with Indigenous scholars here in Australia. Start with acknowledgement of the country. I acknowledge the Kabi Kabi people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. I pay respect to elder, past, present, and emerging, and I recognize that these lands have always been places of learning and teaching. All right, so what we are going to cover, today's session will cover key global frameworks regarding education for Indigenous people and why these goals are important. And I'll introduce you two tools to assess these goals regarding Indigenous people's right to education. So this is a bit of a historical overview of global efforts in education. The World Conference on Education for All in 1990 at Jomtien, Thailand was the first meeting which successfully gathered global attention to inequalities in education. And this was signed by representatives from 155 countries and some 150 organizations. This conference highlighted the existence of the marginalized people without access to education. The progress of Jomtien goals were reviewed in 1996 at the EFA Midterm Review Conference in Amman, Jordan, and again in 2000 at the World Education Forum in Dakar, Senegal. After the United Nations Millennium Summit in 2000, Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, were announced with an ambition of achieving 8 goals by 2015. And in 2016, a new global development framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, were announced to finish up the work left behind MDGs. MDGs and SDGs they're technically not education framework because they cover diverse ranges of topics, including health, poverty, and environment. However, both frameworks position education as key and has significantly shaped global education policy and influenced national strategies around the world. So, why are these frameworks important? Because the countries that signed onto these frameworks have made formal commitments to achieving them. These goals are not merely symbolic. They are deeply tied to international funding structures, particularly official development assistance. Are you all familiar with ODA, official development assistance?
No.
Okay, so the ODA refers to government aid provided to promote the economic development and welfare of developing countries. It plays a critical role in shaping national development, particularly in low-income countries. So why is ODA necessary? Because we live in a world of persistent global inequalities. While some countries can finance their national reform independently, others, often low-income post-colonial states, depend heavily on foreign aid for basic public services, including education. So who are the donor countries? Traditionally, they have been former colonial powers, as well as international organizations such as the United Nations and the World Bank, which are also dominated by those same wealthy countries. So do you see this historical connection? Yeah? The colonial relationship between the colonizer and colony has been reproduced in modern times as a donor-recipient relationship. And of course, the global landscape is shifting. So emerging economies like China and South Korea are becoming new donors. But regardless of the donor, one fact remains: ODA is not a charity. It is strategic, shaped by colonial legacies, economic interest, and geopolitical considerations. So why do frameworks like the MDGs and SDGs matter? Because they guide donor priorities. For instance, Australia is a signatory to the SDGs and has incorporated their language and principles into national policies. So you may have noticed the references to SDGs in UniSC website as well, right? So as a donor country, Australia has the autonomy to decide which goals to prioritize and how to pursue them. But in contrast, recipient countries often lack such flexibility. Many low-income countries, they do not have sufficient public funding even to pay their teacher's salary. So for them to start anything new, they would need foreign assistance. So for these countries, external aid is not supplementary, it's essential. So Australia's ODAs focus primarily on Papua New Guinea and Pacific Island nations, with additional support going to Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, and Laos as well. So Australia's aid policy is explicitly aligned with the SDGs, and this means that the recipient countries must align their education and development strategies with Australia's policy direction, which are in turn informed by the SDGs. So there's much discourse around equal partnership in international development, but the reality is more complex. Recipient countries need funding, while donor countries decide where, how, and under what condition the money is spent. In this sense, global frameworks like the MDGs and SDGs function not only as aspirational goals, but also as the terms of engagement for aid relationships. So to understand this dynamic more deeply, we will begin with an introduction to the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, one of the most influential global frameworks in shaping the educational policies of aid receiving countries. All right, so this is the MDGs. I'm sorry, you can't see anything here. Okay, thank you. So the MDGs were established in 2000 with all 191 United Nations member states and at least 22 international organizations committing to achieve these goals by 2015. So there were 8 MDGs in total, which addressed a range of global challenges, including poverty, health, gender equality, and education. So you can see it here. Goal number 1 was to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. 2 was to achieve universal primary education. And 3, to promote gender equality and empower women. 4, to reduce child mortality. 5, to improve maternal health. 6, to combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. 7, to ensure environmental sustainability. 8, to develop a global partnership for development. So among them, goal 2, as highlighted in the slide, which is about universal primary education, was dedicated specifically to education, while goal 3, which is about gender equality, had a strong implication for educational access and equity. And the MDGs, particularly the education goal, represented one of the most influential global education frameworks to date. They successfully mobilized global attention and resources toward expanding access to primary education and had a profound impact on education policy and practice in many low-income countries. But how could the international community track whether participating countries were making progress towards MDGs? So this was done through a set of defined indicators. Yep. So for education MDGs, the goal 2, which was about a universal primary education, the following key indicators were used. The first one was net enrollment rate in primary education. So this was to measure the percentage of school-aged children who are enrolled in primary school. And the second one, proportion of pupils starting grade 1 who reach grade 5. This is an indicator of progression and retention. So why grade 5 instead of grade 6? Because in many countries, primary education spans 5 years. So this served as a benchmark for basic completion. And then next is youth literacy rate, reflecting the proportion of 15 to 24 years olds who can read and write. And the next two are in relation to gender parity in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. These indicators track progress towards gender equality in access to education. So these indicators became the primary focus of policy attention and investment. In essence, what was measured become what mattered. It's similar, like when you're a student, you study the area that is likely to appear in test, right? So this is exactly what happened. So for recipient countries, demonstrating progress on these indicators was critical to securing ongoing international support. And donor countries, in return, prioritized these metrics because they needed tangible results to report back to their own taxpayers to justify that their aid funds were being used effectively. So what were the problems? As we talked about earlier, both governments receiving and giving aid felt a lot of pressure to meet the Millennium Development Goals. So do you remember which level of education the MDG 2 was about? Primary, right? So, and especially getting more kids into school and, making sure they stayed until they finish. So what actually happened? So to increase the enrollment numbers, schools encourage students to show up, even just once in the first 2 weeks. So if they came even for a day, and they even for a day, then they would be counted as enrolled, even if they don't show up for the rest of the year. So the same thing would happen the next year. A child who missed most of year 1 might show up for the first week of the year 2 and then be counted again. But since they didn't learn much, they struggle to keep up, even if they decide to attend more regularly this time. So this pattern often continued, and by the time students reached the final year of primary school, many still couldn't read or write well. So others simply dropped out, feeling frustrated and felt left behind. For example, I met some students who had to look after their younger siblings during the busy farming season because parents need to work. So they would miss school for weeks, sometimes months. And when they came back, they couldn't understand, what was going on in class. So they'd ask themselves, what's the point of going to school when I can't keep up? Also, because governments were also under pressure to show higher enrollment numbers, a high number of children, they suddenly started going to school. But the school system were not ready. So there were not enough classroom, teachers, or textbooks. So in some places, as you can see in this picture, there were over 100 students in one classroom. And some schools even hired a teacher who had only finished primary education themselves. Resources were stretched. 3 students might have to share one textbook, and they're not allowed to bring that home. So the textbook stays in school. So, you can imagine the quality of learning under this kind of context, right? And another issue was that not every country wanted to focus only on primary education. So some wanted to invest more in high school or universities, but because MDG 2 focused just on primary education, it was hard for countries to develop their whole education system in a balanced way. So while MDGs helped bring more attention and money to primary education, they also caused some problems, while hitting the number became more important than helping students actually learn. Also, another problem is that the basic assumption of MDGs and actually other education goal is that they assume that education is good. Schools are good places. Education, as we know, is mostly viewed in a very positive way, but we need to think about it. Is education always good? As Stephen Bull's famous quote says, policies are introduced into existing patterns of inequalities. So some of the inequalities make education harmful, even dangerous to some students. So education can go wrong. In sub-Saharan Africa, many reports have revealed a heartbreaking reality. Young girls are experiencing sexual violence at the hands of their own teachers inside school that is supposed to be safe places for learning. In some countries, as many as 1 in 4 girls report experiencing sexual violence either in or around school setting. So in this kind of environment, we need to ask an uncomfortable question. Is education always a good thing? And in Cambodia, the challenge is not just poverty, it's also geography. In rural areas, children often walk for hours to get to school along the muddy, unpaved road, sometimes through remote mountain paths where no one's around. And these routes are physically exhausting and also can be dangerous. Children fear animal attacks, and girls are especially vulnerable to sexual violence along the way. Faced with such risk, many children and girls decide to drop out of school entirely. Again, we need to ask, does the push for universal primary education truly benefit all students equally, especially in such an unsafe condition? And in Laos, many indigenous communities live in remote highland area and speak their own languages that are not used in school. So the national education system uses only the official language, which many indigenous children do not understand. So this means that they sit in the class unable to follow the lessons. So even if the universal primary education leads to more children being enrolled, does it actually help them to learn? You know, what good is education if they can't understand their own teacher? And on top of that, in many countries, the school curriculum reflects only the cultures, language, and history of the dominant majority group. Children from minority communities may find no connection to their own identity in what they're being taught. This sends a powerful message that their culture doesn't matter, or it's somehow less important. In these cases, education can become a tool of assimilation, not empowerment. So we must ask, is it really progress if schooling causes children to feel ashamed of who they are? So these are just few examples of the deep, diverse inequalities into which universal primary education, the MDG2, was introduced. Without first addressing these structural issues, which is like violence, distance, language barriers, and cultural exclusion, universal primary education risked reinforcing the very inequalities that it is meant to solve. So how was the global policy of universal primary education enacted on national level? So what kind of policies were made and how did these influence indigenous people? So as an example, I would like to introduce 2 policies in Laos, which were enacted to achieve MDG2. So the first issue is the forced resettlement of indigenous peoples. So as I mentioned earlier, most indigenous communities in Laos, they live in remote highland areas. So the government was thinking to improve access to things like education and healthcare. And the government said that we don't have enough money to build it in remote area. So what they did instead was they encouraged indigenous families to move to larger villages in lower land where the majority ethnic group live. So this resettlement was supported by international organizations like the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, and many other government donors like Australian Aid, on the condition that the relocation was voluntary. But in reality, many indigenous communities could not read or understand the official language in which the consent form was written. Yes. So in such a context, the idea of informed consent can be very problematic. And in the end, many indigenous families moved to the lower lands and were pressured to adopt the language and culture of the dominant group. So this relocation has serious and often devastating consequences. So in the highlands, indigenous people, they traditionally practice slash and burn agriculture, which is suited to the mountain environment. In lowlands, they were expected to switch to paddy rice farming, which is something they are not very familiar. Also, the land that was allocated to them was not of a good quality and was not suitable for farming. So they end up being more impoverished than they were before. And also health outcomes. So malaria-carrying mosquitoes are rare in highlands. So indigenous community, they had not developed natural immunity. So in the lowlands, they were exposed to new health risks. Some studies report that nearly 30% of villagers who had relocated died of malaria. So, and all of this was done in the name of providing access to education and health services. Language? Yeah. Yes, because in the lowland, it's the majority group lives, so they use the majority language, which is Lao. The indigenous groups in the highland, there are like 100-something languages in Laos, and it's very different. So they wouldn't be able to understand, or even if they do, so there's a differences in terms of proficiency and discrimination. Yeah. And the second policy is boarding schools for indigenous children. Once again, the goal was to provide these communities with access to education. And also for the sake of cost efficiency, the government built boarding schools in provincial capitals where the dominant majority group lives. So indigenous children from remote highland areas were sent to these schools and spent most of their adolescent years far from their families, languages, and cultural traditions. And although these schools were intended to serve indigenous students, the curriculum was entirely based on the dominant majority group's language and culture. Yeah, I need to give you a bit more context. In the context of Laos, majority group accounts for just 55%. So there are 45% of ethnic minority, which comes from like 40-something different ethnic groups. So it's a quite really large number of people we are talking about. So because school curriculum was based on the majority group's language and culture, most students they were basically being housed in an environment where they must adapt to the majority language and culture. And then many of the school actually ban schools from speaking their own language. Yeah, so most students could not afford a long journey home during school holidays because it's very expensive, and a lot of minority children, they come from remote area, so it takes like 3 days to get back to their house quite often. So so they remain in the city for months or even years at a time. So while they were receiving an education, it came at a cost of losing touch with their own cultural identity and family connections. So the policies that I've described, including resettlement and boarding school, and the boarding school sound quite similar to what happened with our indigenous peoples here, right? It was designed to expand access to education. On paper, they succeeded in increasing enrollment among indigenous populations. But we need to ask, did these policies truly help them? So from these examples, we can tell that MDG 2 expanded access to education, but it was at the cost of separating indigenous people from their land and lifestyle, and separating indigenous children from their family and cultural ties. So how did these kind of outcomes happen, especially when MDGs were supposed to reduce the inequality? One key reason lies in the way the progress was measured. the main indicators for education, which was enrollment rate and survival to grade 5. So this was calculated using national averages. So governments, which was under pressure to show improvement, they would naturally focus first on areas where it's easy to achieve, which is urban and suburban area. So meanwhile, remote areas where indigenous communities live, where support was most urgently needed, were often left behind. So as a result, the very group who were supposed to benefit from these policies remained the most disadvantaged, and in some cases became even more marginalized. And because the data was based on national averages, inequalities within countries were hidden. These averages made it seem like the progress was being made overall, even as deep disparities persisted beneath the surface. And importantly, there was no indicators to measure the social and cultural cost of these policies, such as assimilation and cultural loss or marginalization. So these impacts went unmeasured and therefore largely unacknowledged in official reporting. So in fact, there has been growing criticism that MDG2, while expanding access to education, also contributed to increased inequality, especially among indigenous and marginalized populations. So reflecting this criticism, in 2016, a new global framework, Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, were announced. Among the 17 goals overarching poverty reduction, health, gender equality, and environment and sustainability, the goal 4 is dedicated to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for all and promote lifelong learning. So the 10 targets for SDG 4 are, as you can see, I'll give you some time to read. And while reading, please think about the differences you noticed from MDG2, which was just about the enrollment and primary education.
Last week, funded the redistribution model, assistant government,
Who funded the relocation?
Yeah.
It was funded by donor organizations like UN organization and some of the bilateral government. Yeah. Okay, so if you're done, maybe can you tell me the differences you might have noticed between MDG2 and SDG4?
Secondary now and actual outcomes. So it says ensure all learners actually acquire so they
Right.
benefits to the children.
Right, exactly.
Getting the educational foundations right for literacy and numeracy. Whereas the indicators.
Sorry, Dal, I don't know if anybody else is having the same problem in the Zoom room. It's very hard to hear what the responses.
Right. Okay. This one doesn't work, right? Okay. What are we doing? So sorry.
Maybe just repeat what they said.
Yeah.
Michael asked.
Yeah, so.
Just the focus is more on secondary education now as well, and on actual benefits to the students, including literacy and numeracy.
Right. So and with that also, so as you can see clearly, it's covering a lot more than the primary now, right? And now there's a focus on inclusivity and equity, so that they have thought about the criticism. And also the other one is that MDG2, because it was just focusing on the primary education, it was considered that, it was considered that, the goal is just for the developing countries, because they assume that primary education is completed for many developed countries. So people have thought, like, why just developing countries? No, don't you also have some, a lot of inequalities within your country? So SDG 4 thought about this. So if you can see these goals, it's something that is applicable to any countries as well. And that's one of the reasons why it's easier, like you hear more about SDGs in Australia than MDG. Oh, thank you. So compared to MDG 2, it's clear that the SDG 4 places much greater emphasis on inclusivity and equity. This is an encouraging shift, particularly for Indigenous people and other marginalized groups. And SDG 4 also introduced more comprehensive indicators, including parity indices, which disaggregated data not only by national averages, but also by gender, rural or urban location, income level, disability, and indigeneity. So this approach offers a much clearer picture of disparities within countries, helping to highlight who is being left behind. And another key improvement is the broader scope of SDG 4. While MDG 2 focused solely on primary education, SDG 4 covers all levels of education, from early childhood through tertiary and lifelong learning. So this opens up more space for system-wide reforms across different stages of education. So in many ways, SDG 4 appears to be a significant improvement over MDG 2. But this leads us to an important question. Will SDG 4 truly make a difference for Indigenous people and other marginalized communities? And how can we begin to answer that? So one way is by using theoretical tools. So I'm going to introduce a tool from now. So because theories help us examine the underlying structures and assumptions that policies are built on. So things that are not always visible on the surface. So it allows us to critically assess the impact of global goals beyond what the indicators alone can tell us. Yes, so I'm going to introduce two tools. But clearly there are many theories that can help us assess the global education policies. But I'm going to introduce two that I feel are especially useful. The first is Nancy Fraser's 3 dimensions of social justice. The second is Rigney's 3 principles for Indigenous research. So I'll start with the Fraser's 3 dimensions of social justice. So according to Fraser, we need to consider 3 interrelated dimensions to fully understand what social justice means in practice. So the first dimension is distribution, which is the economic dimension. So this dimension focuses on whether resources and opportunities are shared fairly. So in the context of education, this means asking, do all students have equal access to schooling? Is it fair if some children have to walk for hours to reach school or must leave their families to attend boarding schools far from home? And do all students have the same access to textbook, qualified teachers, or scholarships? If the answer is no, then the education system may be reinforcing inequality rather than reducing it. And the second dimension is recognition, which is cultural dimension. So recognition is about whether people's identities, such as ethnicity, language, gender, are equally valued in society. So Fraser argues that a just society acknowledges and respects differences and does not require people to assimilate into the dominant group to gain equal respect. So in education, this raises important question. Whose language is used as the medium of instruction? And whose history and culture are reflected in the curriculum? Often, dominant groups' language and culture are centered, while Indigenous peoples and minority groups are expected to adapt or risk being labeled as uneducated or backward. So this kind of cultural hierarchy promotes stereotypes that can lead to discrimination, both inside and outside of classroom. And the third dimension is representation, which is the political dimension. The third representation asks whether people have equal voice, participation, and protection in decision-making processes. So in education, this means asking who creates education policies? Who decides what students learn and how schools are run? And do Indigenous community have a say in how their children are educated? And can they advocate for changes or demand equality? So without political representation, even well-intended policies can marginalize the very communities they aim to support. So by using Fraser's framework, we can see that access to education alone is not enough. True educational justice requires that systems also address economic fairness, cultural inclusion, and a political voice. So from now, I want to practice applying Fraser's 3 dimension to the real world situation. So for those of you, you can join me using the QR code, or you can access the Mentimeter website and join using the code as you can see here. I'm just gonna share a different screen. Hey, can you see the QR code?
Yeah. Eight two.
Yeah. So is everyone online?
Just about.
Do you need some more time? All good? Okay, I'll move on. So let's do some quiz.
Some work.
Yeah. So which dimension of Fraser's social justice does this violate when schools are too far? So you can choose multiple as well. You don't have to choose just one.
Doesn't let me choose one.
Ah,
So you can only choose one.
yeah, because it's okay because this one only has one answer.
Distribution.
Yeah.
If you were arguing it could be all of them, right? Because
Yeah.
policy is about building, that's a political thing. And by virtue of having a school nearby, it's recognizing that there's a community. So it could be all
Right.
of them.
Could be all of them.
Right,
Right,
true,
so
true.
in some respects, they overlap.
Exactly, right. I think everybody's sort of responded.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, as all of you have answered that when schools are far, this is more of a directly related to the issue of access. So access to school. So this is going to be related to the distribution. I'll go with the next one. My language is not used in school education. Which one? Distribution, recognition, and representation.
Relation of loud.
7 million, 8 million. Yeah.
That's the population of Laos.
Yeah, it's a very small population.
Oh.
Yeah, compared to other areas.
Geography.
Yeah, because it's very mountainous place, so the places where people can live is very limited. Okay.
So language is accent also. But maybe it's like. So that's much different than is. It's already different.
Mohammed's asking if accent plays a role in the language difficulties.
Yes, I've noticed that some ethnic groups, they pick up the language pretty easy because they belong to the same language group. But there are like 4 different language groups in Laos. So some students find it very difficult, and it's kind of difficult for them to get rid of the accent. So that sort of serves as a reason why they are being labeled as ethnic minorities, discriminated. Yeah. Yeah, so what I intended with this one, my language is not used in the school education. It's related to culture dimension, so recognition. Another one, I cannot participate in making rules for my children's education. What about this? Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, this is going to be more difficult from now.
I didn't take notes.
But you guys have been listening really well. I'm impressed. Yeah, so this will be related to the political dimension, which is representation, right? Okay, another one. Discrimination is prohibited by law, but there is social pressure that prevents me from talking about discrimination. This is a bit trickier, right?
Yeah, because it's cultural. Oh, social pressure is cultural, isn't it, really?
Okay, yeah, so well, this could be both recognition and representation, but I think what I intended was that because this is more about the right to ask for equality. You know, when you are being discriminated, can you actually, say that like, why are you saying that to me? Yeah. So that's more to do with representation.
Right.
Yeah, another one. The scholarships are available for everyone to apply, but there are disparities in quality of education between urban and rural areas.
Yeah, distribution. Yeah.
Yes, right. This is going to be more to do with the access to some knowledges, access to quality, access to, the differences in access to quality in terms of the location. So this will be more to do with the distribution. The last one. There are illustrations of different ethnic groups included in textbooks, but certain groups are always at the center.
Recognition.
Very good. Yeah, so I see some confusion around this recognition and representation. Just think about it as economic distribution, cultural recognition, and political representation. Yeah, so the economic distribution, cultural recognition, and political representation, then that's going to be a bit easier. Okay. So because here we are talking about that, that people are being sort of being labeled differently depends on which ethnic group you come from, right? So this is more of a cultural discrimination. That's why it's will be related to recognition. All right, so now the real question, more difficult one starts.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is that now let's look at SDG 4 targets using the 3 dimensions. So we went through this. We went through this again. So I'm just gonna start with the first one. So, free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education leading to relevant learning outcomes. Which dimension of social justice is it? Economic distribution, culture recognition, political presentation, representation. I'm sorry.
Distribution. Economic distribution.
Very good. Oh, Ines is A student. Yeah, so distribution, but if quality is defined in certain way, it could be, you know, other other dimension as well. But it the target itself, it doesn't say, you know, what they mean by quality. So it's just basically it doesn't mean anything because when you don't define it.
Quality to who?
Yeah, so it's just talking about access to school schooling.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go with the next one. So quality early childhood education to be ready for primary education.
Yeah, distribution. Access. No.
Right.
Policy, so,
Access.
yeah.
Okay.
Just like we're now having bills in Parliament about
Mm.
early childhood centres being safe. In
Oh.
Australia, that's happening at the political level.
Right.
Those laws and then policies that are
Mm.
forced upon.
There's
teachers.
political level as
Ah.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll move on because we have 10. So yes, again here, they don't really say what they mean by quality. So it's just talking about access here. So distribution. Affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education. What about this?
It's again distribution. It's
Yes.
economic.
Yeah.
Why in the second one is it, no, why in the first one is it about free and equitable, but in the second and third, which seem to be doing similar things, is other words, free and equitable?
Yeah.
Two, there was no reference to money to say at all, or equity.
Mm.
The technical and vocational is assumption that the students or the parents will contribute to that. Whether it's primary and secondary, it's provided by the state for free, so.
But why is there no reference in the second one about early child?
Can you
Tell me these words like labor, this is bad, I just find them intriguing, and then, you know, it's exclusively.
get this microphone up
Yeah.
closer so we can hear?
Also, any of these could also be depending on context. So I'm thinking about the context that I'm trying to work in now at PNG. And one of the biggest problems is representation, because the government have a view that they should be putting all of their aid money into the elite older students who have made it into university and helping them to become career focused in priority areas for the government like STEM. And I've even had DFAT people say to me, oh, well, literacy should have been addressed 10 years ago. That was the time to deal with it. This is from an Australian aid organisation. So, you know, sorry, we're not going to fund that because basically the government, the people who are, you know, in charge of determination of their country say, we don't want the money spent on that. We want it spent on the people who've managed to make it through to tertiary education, because they're the ones that we can now help realistically. Let's do that. So then it becomes, education generally becomes, in this context, all about representation, and partially distribution, because the ones who are left behind are the ones who are Indigenous people living in remote areas. Yeah.
They overlap.
Sorry, thank you, Michael. And now what about the next one? Increase the number of youth and adults with skills for employment and entrepreneurship. Yeah, you see the pattern here. Yeah. Yeah.
Discursively, I always have it, I find it interesting that that entrepreneurialism is linked to employment. So in other words, if there's no employment, the onus is on you, make your own employment. Well, yes, how equitable is that, you know? So
Right.
the only problem specifically.
Yeah, and yeah, keep going. Number 5. Eliminate gender disparities in education and ensure equal access to all levels of education for the vulnerable. Distribution. You know, it goes like this until,
Yeah.
yeah. Number 6, ensure all youth and a substantial portion of adults achieve literacy and numeracy, access to certain type of knowledge. But if they mention that literacy in their own mother tongue, this would have been very different story, right? But it doesn't. It says literacy. Exactly, right. But it doesn't go that far. So it's just literacy. So at this point, what's just clear here is distribution.
Yeah.
And number 7, ensure all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. Okay, what do they mean by sustainable development? Yeah, again. And also what knowledge, which knowledge? It doesn't say. Yeah, so I think they could have each added like, more local knowledges or skills, then it would have been, a very different rule, but it doesn't. So just distribution here as well. Build and upgrade educational facility, distribution, clearly. Expand the number of scholarships available to developing countries for enrollment in higher education, distribution. But then again, like, why just developing countries here? Like, don't we have inequality for university entrance here as well?
Yes.
Number 10, increase the supply of qualified teacher, just distribution.
There's a bit of a pattern.
Yeah. So we went through all 10 targets, and we can tell that all targets relates to economic dimension. No targets address the cultural and political inequalities. So now, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. So this is another global framework that has had a profound influence on Indigenous people. And I'm going to explain more about this later, but as a start, let's just first look at some of the articles from UNDRIP from using Fraser's 3 dimensions. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status. Yes, very clearly representation, and you can instantly see how different it is from the SDGs, right? Yeah, can you? That's good. Okay, the next one, we see. Indigenous people have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institution. What about this?
Recognition.
Recognition and also political,
Yeah,
right?
representation.
Economic. So it's all of them actually.
Mm.
Hmm. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Yes, so this speaks for the culture dimension, but also definitely there's the element of political representation here as well. So like what I'm trying to show here is that the UNDRIP has been very different from other goals. SDG 4 was just about the economic distribution, while UNDRIP is more balanced. But one thing to remember is that UNDRIP was announced in 2007, and SDGs in 2016. So they sort of like, regress the progress that has been made by the UNDRIP. Okay. So actually the UNDRIP, it has like 46 articles and each article is fairly long. So I couldn't include it all here, but I highly recommend you to, go through those, articles if you are interested.
And it was opposed. Initially opposed.
Yeah. So I'll just give you some outlines about what UNDRIP was about. So UNDRIP sets out key rights for Indigenous people, including self-determination, cultural preservation, and the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, especially when it comes to land and resources. So UNDRIP was adopted in 2007 by the UN General Assembly with 144 countries voting in favor. However, 4 countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States, you see the commonality among these countries, right? They initially voted against it. Yeah. Why?
Colonial.
Yeah. So there were like 3 main reasons behind their opposition. First was in relation to the land right, because these countries were concerned that the declaration, especially Article 26, which was about the Indigenous people's right to their traditional land. So they thought this could be used to challenge existing land ownership laws. So they feared it might lead to claims over traditional lands, including lands now privately owned or used for mining and development. And second, the issue of self-determination. So UNDRIP affirms Indigenous people's right to self-determination, which these government worried could be interpreted as the right to political independence or succession. So this raised concerns about national sovereignty. And third, legal uncertainty. Parts of the declaration, like free, prior, and informed consent, were seen as vague. So these countries were unsure whether it implied that Indigenous groups could veto state decisions, especially in areas like resource development. So, when the government decide to approve the mining, my indigenous group might, veto. So despite these concerns, all 4 countries eventually reversed their position. Australia endorsed UNDRIP in 2009, followed by New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. However, every country framed the declaration as non-binding and committed to implementing it within their existing legal framework. So while they now support UNDRIP, their initial position highlights ongoing tensions between Indigenous rights, national law, and state sovereignty. And although it is not legally binding, it has significant influence in shaping national laws, reconciliation efforts, and international standards around Indigenous rights. So this one shows the changes of Australia's stance with the UNDRIP. So Australia initially voted against it when it was adopted in 2007. So the Howard government at the time raised several concerns, which I introduced you earlier. So, however, this position changed in 2009 under Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, shortly after the government's formal apologies to the stolen generations. So Australia officially endorsed UNDRIP, recognizing as an important framework for improving relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So that said, Australia made it clear that it considered the declaration to be non-binding and would interpret it within its limits of Australian legal system. So in other words, while symbolically powerful, endorsement did not create any new legal rights, but served as a commitment to improving Indigenous policy and engagement. So since then, UNDRIP has been referenced in national discussions on issues like constitutional recognition, closing the gap, and the voice to parliament. But many argue that full implementation still requires stronger political will and legal reform. So far, I've talked about the global education framework and introduced Fraser's 3 dimensions of social justice as a tool to assess a framework in relation to Indigenous rights frame. And as the last part of the session, I will introduce another tool for policy assessment. And this is a theoretical tool developed by an Indigenous scholar, LesterIrabinna Rigney. So Rigney is an Aboriginal scholar who is known for his work on Indigenous research epistemology. Rigney's 3 principles for Indigenous research offer lenses that are quite different from Fraser's 3 dimensions. So the first one is resistance as the emancipatory imperative. So it says research is inherently political, serving as a tool to confront systemic injustice and promote decolonization. Indigenous research should empower Indigenous communities by upholding their right to self-determination and actively opposing colonial control and oppression. So this principle can be translated into this question: how does the research or policy challenge systemic injustice? And second principle is political integrity. For research to effectively support the political goals of Indigenous peoples' liberation, it must be led by Indigenous Australians and directly connected to the real-life struggles faced by their communities. This ensures that researchers remain accountable to their communities and are actively contributing to their collective fight for justice and self-determination. So this principle can be translated into this question of who is doing the research and who's making the policy. The last one is privileging Indigenous voices in research. So Indigenous research centers on the lived realities, historical experiences, cultural traditions, aspirations, and ongoing struggles of Indigenous people. It positions Indigenous Australians as the primary subjects, ensuring their voices, perspectives, and knowledge are foregrounded and respected throughout the research process. So again, this can be changed into this question of how does the research or policy uphold Indigenous voices and knowledges? So with that in mind, I want you to have a look at this Sustainable Development SDG 4 targets again. And I will, using Rigney's 3 principles. So I will ask you some question that is informed by each of these principles. So I want you to try to answer this question by going through the targets. So the first one is resistance as the emancipatory imperative. So how does this policy challenge systemic injustice for Indigenous people? How does this policy, the target, challenge systemic injustice?
All those policies.
Yeah, the targets. Is there anything to do with the systemic injustice?
It doesn't challenge them.
And it's actually quite hard to answer, right? Because one of the issues, because we've already done this with the Fraser's 3 dimensions, so we know that this is more, to do with economic distribution. So there is it's not really challenging. It's not really challenging anything from the culture and political dimension. We know, but that with only using only Rigney's three principle, it's kind of hard because Rigney doesn't really provide the tools to, you know, dismantle, what type of injustice we are talking about, right? So now let's try with the second one, which is political integrity. So try to answer this question. Who makes the policy? Are Indigenous peoples making their own policy? Are any of the targets about Indigenous people making their own rules? What's the answer? Any of the targets relate to, you know, Indigenous people making their own rules? Does it say anything about that? No, right? And the third one, privileging Indigenous voices in research. So how does the policy uphold Indigenous voices and knowledges? Does it say anything about like how to uphold Indigenous voices and knowledges? No. So so today I introduced two theoretical tools to assess the policies for Indigenous people. The first one was the Fraser's 3 dimension of social justice, which was developed by a non-Indigenous scholar. And the second one was Indigenous scholars' work, Rigney's 3 principles of Indigenous research. So Fraser's 3 dimensions, it helps us to think about Indigenous minority rights from multiple angles. However, Fraser's dimension assumed that policy is made by non-Indigenous people. That's why we need the cultural, political, all this kind of, you know, dimension. And so one of the dimension, political representation, it's talking about the political rights, but it's more for the rights for participation. It doesn't go as far as self-determination. On the other hand, Rigney's 3 principles highlight that policy should be about challenging racist system and made and implemented by Indigenous peoples through upholding Indigenous values. Because it argues for self-determination, there is no need for multiple dimension. You know, when Indigenous people make their own policies, upholding their own values and knowledges, the policy will be, you know, culturally, economically, politically, you know, appropriate. But the reality is that most policies are made by non-Indigenous people. So Rigney's 3 principles are limited in explaining how a policy violates Indigenous rights. That's why we couldn't answer the first question. And this is why I introduced these 2 theoretical tools, because these 2 ask different types of questions that are both helpful for researchers studying global and local policies for Indigenous people. So my presentation was up to here. If you have any question.
That's great. Any questions, anybody?
Do you have the references to the models? Because I'd like to share them with one of my PhD students. Oh, all of them Fraser's, the ones you showed.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can share a slide and the references.
Yeah. We'll forward the slides and references to everyone.
I just had a question or sort of comment, sort of mostly comment. I really like the ways that you point out both the benefits and downsides of both models. And so I feel like it's in a sense an argument to use both in tension with each other.
Right.
And I think that that's a really nice nuanced way of understanding social justice and epistemic justice as well. And it kind of addresses that kind of post-structural both and rather than either or. It's not Fraser or Rigney or the other way around. It's both and, you know, so I think that that's really a nuanced way to understand both the potentials of these tools and their limitations. Yeah, thank you. Very, very helpful. Yeah.
The chat. Yeah, please. Right. Yeah. Right.
Very illuminating. Thank you very much,
Thank you
Dal.
so much.